And we're back now with Virginia Senator Mark Warner, who is part of what they call the Gang of Six. This is a group, a bipartisan group, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, who have been working behind the scenes for about 4 months now to try to come up with some sort of compromise that can get through both the Senate and the House. Let me just start with the raising the debt ceiling. You just heard what Congressman Ryan said. What is your reaction to that?
Well, Bob, I think it's dangerous to kind of roll the dice on the debt limit. I mean, frankly, unlike the government shutdown, which I got to tell you, I was embarrassed for the Congress and for the country that we allowed us to get to that 11th hour with the back and forth tit for tat. We can't do that with the debt limit. You get close to that debt limit and you could actually scare the bond markets. They could end up raising interest rates, which would dramatically cut back on the recovery, not just in terms of the government spend, but somebody going out trying to get a loan, trying to close on a house, a company trying to hire a new employee. This is literally potentially lighting the match that could burn down the house. So I hope our colleagues on both sides will go ahead and raise the debt limit. Some, I know Congressman Ryan and others have said that we need some level of down payment on spending cuts. We're looking at trying to include that in our bipartisan approach. If there's one thing we've seen, particularly looking at the government shutdown proposal, it's if both political parties start at either end of the spectrum and fight, the only people who really lose in that are the American people. We're saying on this big issue of debt and deficit, we need to start out of the center, start with a bipartisan plan, and build out.
Well, what I thought was interesting about what Congressman Ryan said this morning, because Treasury Secretary Geithner was on 2 television shows this morning and said flatly that Republican leaders had assured the president behind closed doors that they would vote to raise the debt limit ceiling. And yet, Mr. Ryan, who's a key player over there in the House, said no way, no how. And he said nobody had told him that. And I find it hard to believe that they might have said that and not tell Congressman Ryan.
Well, it's hard to imagine anybody that responsibly understands the consequences of dealing or failing to raise the debt limit, particularly with the uncertainty in Europe in terms of the sovereign debt crisis going on in countries like Ireland and Greece and now Portugal, with the uncertainty in the Middle East. The idea that we would, in effect, roll the dice with the world economy by getting into this brinksmanship, I think it would be beyond the pale. Now, there clearly are members, particularly a number of the new members in the House, who've said they will draw the line and not raise the debt limit. My only hope is that saner and cooler heads will prevail.
Let's talk about your group. You've been meeting now for months. Are you anywhere close to having something that you think is a solid plan that could be taken seriously in both houses?
Well, Bob, we're very close. I mean, I give Congressman Ryan credit for a serious plan, but I think what we've seen in the reaction to Congressman Ryan's plan is he basically says no new revenues of any kind. He says defense spending is walled off. That means the only place that he can go to get his deficit reduction is really this massive transfer of more responsibility onto our seniors in terms of paying for health care. Now, that's one approach. It's not an approach I think that the vast majority of Americans would want. What we're doing is we're saying everything has to be on the table. Entitlement reform, dramatic spending cuts, looking at tax reform, yes, the way he talked about lowering rates, excluding and getting rid of some of the tax expenditures, but where we'll actually raise some additional revenues. And I think if we start with a bipartisan plan, I think there's a whole host of folks in both parties that want to be for something that's something that would actually start as a bipartisan effort. And I think the importance of what we're doing is not only to take on the issue of debt and deficit, but I think to once again demonstrate that actually Congress can work.
Senator, you are a Democrat. You are a conservative Democrat from a very conservative state, Virginia. Do you think that we can solve the deficit problem without raising taxes in some way?
Bob, I think you've got to look at both sides of the ledger. Long before I was in politics, I spent 20 years in business. I built companies, and you've got to look at the revenue side, you've got to look at the spend side. We're looking at a ratio of about $3 in cuts for every additional dollar in revenues. And the revenues we're talking about literally are coming from lower rates, where we can lower our rates on individual and on corporate rates back to where they're much more competitive on a worldwide basis, but we're getting rid of a number of the tax expenditures. I mean, a fact that I'm not sure most Americans realize, we collect about $1 trillion a year in income taxes, yet we have $1.2 trillion a year in income tax expenditures. Deductions, many of them that are popular, charitable deduction, home mortgage deduction. If we would cut back on some of those, we could actually lower rates and still increase revenues.
So that's where you would get the additional revenues, by eliminating deductions, not necessarily by raising taxes.
We're not talking about raising taxes.
What about the Congressman Ryan's plan, of course, to, he not only wants to keep the Bush tax cuts in place, but he does talk about, he says it's not a tax cut, he talks about reducing the rates. Will that fly?
Well, Bob, I guess we ought to disagree, be able to disagree about our solutions, but we shouldn't be able to disagree about the facts. The facts are right now, we are spending at an all-time high, close to 25% of our GDP being spent on the federal government, but our revenues are at an almost all-time low, at about 15%. It doesn't take a math wizard to figure out that delta can't be sustained. So we need both a way to have the tax code generate more revenues, we need to bring spending down, and we have to do it in a way that still protects certain investments where we can grow our economy. One of the things that Congressman Ryan's plan did, it cut back about 25% of our investments in education. It cut back about 70% of our investments in alternative energy, and with gas approaching $4 a gallon, I'm not sure that's in the best interest of a long-term economic growth. We've got to have all three legs of the stool. We've got to have a tax code that's more efficient, we've got to cut back on spending, but we've still got to have an economy that's going to grow.
Do you think that President Obama's speech helped or hurt the effort to get a bipartisan solution? I know it caught the folks working with you a little bit by surprise, but was it a help or did it hurt?
I think the President laid out his vision, and in a real stark contrast to where Congressman Ryan laid out his vision. And I think what we've got now is we've got two competing visions. What I hope is that this doesn't devolve into just the Democrats versus the Republicans again. We saw what happens when that takes place, when we got to the 11th hour on the government shutdown, and most Americans kind of scratched their head and said, why couldn't these guys get their job done? What we're trying to do with a bipartisan group is say, let's actually start with something that takes a lot of the ideas from the Simpson-Bowles Commission, puts everything on the table, and let me assure you, we're going to make everybody mad with our approach. Democrats, Republicans, independents, because we're touching every part of the problem, all the entitlement programs, looking at how you make Social Security more sustainable, and we're going to lay this out, and our hope and prayer is that then the people of goodwill from both parties will basically check their Democrat hat and check the Republican hat and say, let's take this on, because my belief is this debt and deficit crisis is our single biggest national security issue.
And I did hear you say you're going to have to reform Social Security to do it.
It's part of this is just math. 16 workers for every one retiree 50 years ago, 3 workers for every retiree now.
All right. Thank you so much, Senator.